All right then, welcome. Welcome to this session where we will be talking about how running applications in Azure is slightly different to what you have been used to before you did anything in Azure. Now, what I've noticed is that there is like two ways to do it. You either just go happy-go-lucky and party on and do things, and you know, that's great. You usually get things done, for sure. Slightly worried, though, that some chaos may ensue after a while, after you've done it for a bit. And then you start to figure out, well, how do I do it well? You have to go back and you have to like research and figure out how to correct things that now are out of shape. So this session kind of aims towards giving you the clues that you might need to begin in shape and stay there, hopefully. So I want to ask you guys first, how many of you do have a deployment in Azure which is in production? That's half of the room. All right. Well, I see those numbers consistently going up. I've been talking about Azure for a long time, in fact, for a decade. Azure is that old. And I've been talking about Azure since the beginning. And in the beginning, I had to ask the question rather, do you have an Azure account? Have you activated your Azure benefits and so forth, right? And have you been doing anything with Azure and so forth? But nowadays, I find that most people actually have done something with Azure, so that question is moot. Instead, I go with, do you have anything in production? And I see those numbers steadily going up, which is cool. My name is Magnus Mårtensson. I assume you read that from the session description. I'm an MVP for Azure. I was the first one to become an Azure MVP in the Nordic countries. So it means that I've been there for a long time. I was in the audience when they announced what was then called Windows Azure, which is now called Microsoft Azure. I'm also what Microsoft call a regional director, which is a bit of a funny title because I don't work at Microsoft, I don't have a region, and I don't direct anything. But it means that I'm a friend of Microsoft and I hang out with Microsoft. I'm close to the people there and I talk to Microsoft at a VP level, which is a nice benefit for me. It's fun, but it means that I'm a good friend of Microsoft. So if you have any curious, difficult questions that you want to have asked, and if I like it, I might ask it and see if I can get you an answer. Either way, if you have any follow-ups on this session and so forth, just email me, no problem. That's my company, Loftysoft, right there. If you like this presentation, send me a nice tweet. That's also cool. Before we begin, of course, I cannot start without saying something about the Global Azure Bootcamp. Do you know what that is? Yes? Some people are nodding. The Global Azure Bootcamp is an annual huge event, and we are about to announce when the 2019 event is. Welcome, come on in. The 2019 event is going to take place. We will see. It's going to be in April, and we will soon announce. There is a conference next week on a different continent, right? A large one with 25,000 or 26,000 attending. It might be that we will announce it during that conference. This is all community. And that means that all of these locations are driven by community enthusiasts that have user groups, and we all do this huge event on the same day called the Global Azure Bootcamp, which means that it's like several hundreds of locations and about 15,000 people attending this event annually. It's pretty massive. Lots of fun there. Now, let's take a quick look at what Azure kind of looks like now. This is one of those eye charts, right? You cover one eye and you try to read the fine print. So this is just, it's actually an old one. It's very old. This one says 40 data center regions. It's not true. It's about 52 now. But I keep this one as a reminder. It's a wow chart, right? It's supposed to tell you, oh my gosh, there's so much in Azure. So the first question is kind of, how much is there? Yeah, well, we can find that out, actually. It's possible to do. But the point here is that as you start using Azure, you will probably start using, various bits and things from here, and maybe some storage. There's some virtual machines here, and some web applications, and so forth. And your portfolio and instance count of resources in Azure will steadily grow. And that's going to give you some very interesting challenges, such as, how do I manage access control to these resources? How do we do deployment to all of our environments that we have? How do we monitor all of these things and alert when something goes wrong? And unfortunately, it's going to cost us money. So how do we figure out how much the various things cost? How do we break down the cost? How do we divide the bill? You know, the bean counters are going to come around knocking. They're going to say, hey, we are currently spending about $100,000 on Azure resources per month. Would you like to tell us, you know, how much is R&D costing us? How much is production costing us? And so forth. These are questions that you can answer using the resource management benefits or the features thereof. Deployment is something very near and dear to me, of course, and it should be to all of us. We probably have lots of environments when we run our code, right? We have multiple environments. We have maybe multiple geographies as well. So we may have production in more than one location and around the world. That might happen. Maybe you have only one place, but at least you will have several test environments and staging environments and development environments and so forth. And how do you ensure that all of these are equal all the time? Well, equal enough, I guess. The coolness here is that you can make one production environment with very large machines and have a development environment with a very, very small machine. But in other respects, how do we make sure that they are equal? Well, to tackle all of these things, Microsoft has created this model called the Resource Manager. And I'm going to give you sort of an overview of what that is and how it works so that you can sort of get how and why they kind of built this. Any resource that wants to show up in the Azure Portal that you can provision instances of, they have to all implement this provider contract. The provider contract connects the service to Azure. Many of these services are Microsoft services, but in fact, not all of them are. So how do you then interact with this? Well, you use tools such as, you can use the tooling in Visual Studio. You can go to the Azure Portal. You can use an SDK or something like that, and use these tools to connect to and manage your resources. But in between, of course, there is something additional, and that is the RESTful API, the management endpoint of Azure. So regardless of which tool or if you're using the command line, it doesn't matter. All of them, bottom line is that they connect to this RESTful API, this endpoint. And that's how you connect to and manage your applications and your services in Azure. So obviously, with the Resource Manager, you can deploy your application resources. That's great. Additionally, it's a way to organize your resources so that you may sort of group them together in logical groups that make sense to you. And because you're doing that, it becomes quite easy to apply access control to these resources. Now, I'm a firm believer in letting everyone in the team see what we have in production and see how it works. But there's a read-only setting there, right? Very few people, if any, maybe it's even deployed only using a principal, using a machine, right? A deployment server to production. Almost no one human should be having any type of contributor or owner access to the production system. Because what happens is that somebody thinks it's a really good idea to start changing settings, and all of a sudden your settings are not equal on the QA environment and the production environment. And you start testing things that are not equal in production. And then when you go to production, you get problems. So access control is super important as well. So to group your things together, it starts with something called a resource group. I'm sure most of you know what that is. But to explain sort of the context of that is that you will create a resource group when you deploy a resource. You can put a resource, of course, in a pre-existing resource group, but it has to have at least every resource must be in one resource group. Now, it's not sort of a fence or something or a security boundary or anything at all. You can communicate with resources in other resource groups. It's just sort of a bucket, if you will, a place to put your thing. Another really funny thing is that you give a resource group a location, so you create one in the East Australia data center, perhaps, and you give it a location there, and then you can put resources inside of it that are not in that location. It doesn't matter. It's not bound to that. It's just a piece of metadata that groups your things together in a logical way. So I'm going to show you now Azure Resource Management. We're going to start with the simplest possible so-called Azure Resource Management template. So there's a templating thing we do here. It's going to be this. Is it large enough? You can see? Good. So this is a template. In fact, there's one more thing you can do here. It's functions. It's not common that you use that. Well, it's starting to get more and more. It's growing on me. But this is a template. It's empty. There's nothing there at all to deploy. So I created a different template, which actually does have something in it. This one. In case you're wondering what tool this is Visual Studio Code in full screen mode. Okay, there's a really cool mode here. This is what it normally looks like, but if you do Control K and then Z, oops, I can't do it there. I got to do it in there. K and then Z, you go into full screen mode, which is called Zen mode. So now we are in Zen mode. I try to stay in here as much as I possibly can. It's lovely. We are in Zen mode, and somebody please call out to me, what is it that we are creating here today? A storage account. That is correct. It says right there. So that's the point. A template, regardless if you have ever seen one before, is human readable. It's a data block of JSON. So you can read it, you can understand, sort of figure out what it's about, even if you've never seen one. So if I were to deploy, take this template and run it in Azure, deploy it to Azure, then it's going to create for me a storage account. So why don't we do that? In fact, I'm going to start with running, well, I'm actually going to run that. It's a little bit slow. Isn't that the internet is always slow in Australia? Oh, sorry, that was a cheap shot. So we are going to create an empty bucket. And that's done with the commandlet new Azure RM resource group. Create me an empty bucket. And first I'm going to actually show you Azure, show you that I do not have that bucket here. I have some other test stuff, but my bucket's going to be called ARM for the win. And so I create the bucket. Oops. My trackpad is really off. And there we go. So ARM for the win. I just created this empty bucket in Azure, and now I can fill it with something useful. And so let's first use this null template, the template that didn't specify any resource at all, and run it against Azure using the commandlet new Azure RM resource group deployment. In fact, to run deployments against Azure, you kind of need to know 2 PowerShell commandlets. That's it. I've already showed you both of them. So if I run this and run this null template against Azure, you can see that I'm verbose printing here. There's a valid template. I'm going to do a deployment. And hey, I'm complete because there weren't any resources to actually deploy. So that worked fine. It was a valid template, but it didn't actually specify any resources. So I'm going to show you my mad PowerShell skills there by selecting the other file, not the hashtag in front there, or hash symbol in front, and execute that. So now we're running the template which deploys a storage account. So it's going to now take a little while to provision this storage account. There's a person now running through the data center with a disk. No. but it could be. No, not really, of course. This is all self-provisioning naturally. It could take a few seconds for that to complete. Look at that, nicely like this. And while it's doing that, we're going to figure out, let's see. Oh, really? That's an unusual amount of seconds. We'll see. Welcome to Australia. Well, thank you. There we go, storage account. So over in Azure now, we can refresh, and yes, we have a storage account, right? And now I can store like terabytes of data in Azure. Very cool. What happens, do you think, if I go back and rerun this null template? I run the same deployment that the first one I did with the empty template. What happens when I do this? There's a clue on the screen. Anyone? Well, the thing is that I specified no resources. And I also specified the not default setting, the default setting or the default mode is incremental. This is the not default setting, the complete mode. And in complete mode, it's actually going to deploy all the resources in my template, and it's going to remove resources that are not in my template, which in this case means that it's actually going to remove my storage account. This is a fun trick to play on your work friends, but don't do it in the production environment. That will freak people out. What this does is goes and deprovisions, decommissions, and removes my storage account again. So that's how that works. We can, take a look at that, that it's actually gone later if we want to. But trust me, it's going to be gone. So templates are declarative. You can read them as a human being, and you can understand, roughly, what they are about. They are idempotent. If you do the same deployment over and over again, if I were to re-execute that create storage account template 10 times, nothing's going to change. It's going to deploy the storage account once, and then the next time it's going to check to see, we need this storage account. Yep, we already got it. Done. Right? And of course, this means that you can deploy, we only had one service, okay? I'm going to show you something with two. It's not going to be very much more complicated, but the list of resources can be very long. I've deployed tens of resources. And I try to keep it as few as possible for simplicity, but sometimes the number of resources in a resource group kind of grows. And I also try to keep it to one template for one resource group, so that I don't have multiple templates deploying into the same resource group, is what I usually try to do. And I always try to keep with this incremental mode, not the complete mode. It's kind of dangerous. But now that you know that we can deploy resources to resource groups, a quick question here: how do I divide or section my application? We have here a web application, virtual machine, maybe with an Oracle database, who knows, and a storage account. These belong to my application. Do I create one resource group for these, or do I put them in separate resource groups? Remember, there is no boundary as such as they can communicate. It doesn't have anything to do with security or connectivity or anything at all. Which is better? Good. Oh my gosh. The hint is kind of, do they have a common life cycle and management? And you are correct, sir, at the front row here. It's up to you. It depends. Of course it depends. You don't have to deploy them in the same resource group, but kind of it's a clue if they belong together in the same lifespan. If you modify or change or deploy a new web application, that could happen, but it's highly likely that you want to retain your data for a longer time. And therefore, maybe in this case would be logical to put them in separate resource groups, perhaps. Also, maybe from management perspectives, you can give access to a specific resource in Azure, absolutely, and have other resources in the same resource group that the manager, the person who administers that resource, can't even see them. But usually, quite commonly, I try to give access to Azure with on the resource group level. That's more manageable. So you have all of these environments we talked about before. Many of them, maybe who is doing anything serious and building anything serious that has less than 3 environments? I mean, that doesn't happen. You have your QA, your production, your test environments, your dev environments, at least 4, probably more. That's normal. And so you have all of these environments. And if you have templates for these, does that mean that I need one template for each environment? Sounds harsh. No, in fact, obviously no. You strive to, or actually, I would go so far as to say you have to have just one template for all of your environments. And then you vary the templates with a parameter file so that you have certain settings for your development environment and other settings for your production environment. Your production environment maybe has large machines and 10 of them. Your development environment maybe only has one small one. But they still kind of do the same, right? You can still deploy the code to the small machine. It's just in the large context, you might want more power. Of course, that's going to cost more as well, so you can save money on your development. But it's still one template. So I'm going to show you how to deploy many environments in one go, and I really hope this works. I did the thing you're not supposed to do, a last-minute change. No, Magnus, that's bad. So we're going to take a look at what we're going to deploy first. And the thing we're going to deploy is not that. We are going to deploy this. And it's a slightly longer template now with a few parameters coming in. We didn't have any parameters in the first one, but there's a website name, a SKU name, which is the size of your web application we're going to deploy here, a SKU capacity, how many instances, and then of course also in this case I sent in an environment name, but I don't think I'm using that right now. Anyways, down here below we have our resources. There's two of them. The first resource is for those who have deployed web applications to Azure know that you have to have an app service plan to attach your web applications to. The funny thing is that an app service plan underneath the covers is a Microsoft.web/server farms. So an app service plan is a server farm. It's really funny. I think somebody said, you know, we can't call it server farms anymore. That's, you know, old stuff. We have to call it something cool. And then they went and called it app service plans, and now nobody knows what the hell that is. So it's a little bit ironic. The second resource that we're also going to deploy here is a website. So it's quite simple, this deployment as well. This is going to be an app service. And if you go and check, that's the name is Microsoft.web/sites. So it's a website, but you know, sites probably sounds old-fashioned. It's all about the apps these days, so now it's called an app service. Right, so we can take this and deploy it using, of course, the standard template approach. I created a piece of PowerShell here with values for different environments. We have a development, a testing, and a production environment. And they go together with a parameter file for each. Unfortunately, the screen size here makes it so that I have to flip back and forth, but that's fine. A website name in this case, and it's going to actually deploy just one small site for us because there were default values in my templates. So if I go to the production environment instead, you'll see that in this parameter file, I also specify that I want the size to be S1 and I want the instance count to be 2. In the first one, I'm using the defaults for these values. It's going to give us a free website, the size free, the smallest one, and just one instance. So I can vary these parameter files here, and then what I want to do is I want to run these in parallel. I'm going to log into Azure, select my subscription, create a resource group, and do a deployment. So if it goes well, it's going to start up several deployments here for us. Hopefully it does that. I'm curious if I broke the script or anything. We'll see if it, you know, we'll let that run in the background. The point is, if it works the way it should, I should be getting more resource groups here in Azure. I'm not getting any now, so it might be that I broke my script. It doesn't matter much, actually. The point is that this template parameter stuff is how you use just one template with many environments. And I recently did sort of a consolidation with a client. They had unfortunately not used that scheme to have one template per environment. They had 5 environments, yes, 5, and 3 geographies for their production as well. So they had additional locations there, and unfortunately had one template for each of them. And the template was 1,000 lines long, so it's not that bad, but it's also not that great. And ironically, there was an even number of parameters that they sent into that. How many parameters do you think there were? Well, it's a very round number, 100. 100 parameters, and looking at that and going like, this is absolutely crazy. And for each new port and the things that they had to add, they added more parameters. And so the file continued to grow. And then I had to like compare them together. What I managed to do, doing this right, consolidate all the parameters, crunch them together, make them into little JSON objects instead. You can do that. I managed to get that down to 12, 15 parameters or something like that. And the size, and then of course I moved from 7, I think, different template files to just one template file of 1,000 lines. And then I made that smaller, down to 384 lines. So, I mean, you can do that. You can do it. I mean, their template worked, right? The maintainability was horrible. So they're wasting time by not doing it well. And if you do it well, you can really be effective and really have something which is manageable. And so just an example that this template stuff is not just toys, it's real. So we will continue. So now that you know that you can deploy stuff to Azure, there's a bunch of tooling, of course, that we haven't talked about yet. You can use the Azure Portal, right, to deploy your resources. That's okay, it's valid. Specifically if you're trying things out and you're looking, what are the options, what can I deploy, and so forth. And there's a UI inside of Visual Studio, and so that you can use as well. But there's a new sort of player. I don't think that I kind of need to explain that to this group. You seem to be okay. But oftentimes when I talk to IT pros, they become either upset or annoyed, and they don't want to adopt this new tool. And I'm talking, of course, about Visual Studio Code. Because human beings are not susceptible to change, really. We don't like when things change. And I love using this picture to sort of exemplify that, because as you all can see, this is a wagon which is automatically able to be mobile on its own without a horse. It's an automobile, right? And because some people were so afraid of these things in the beginning, they would sometimes mount the horse's head on the front there so that people weren't so scared anymore. And also some of the early designs of these had a whip holder, because if you don't have a whip holder, we're going to put the whip, right? Makes sense. So yes, important. And so humans, we don't like change. But Visual Studio Code, how many here use PowerShell ISE? The application, yeah? You do, yeah? It's great, except that it's never going to have a new release, a new version. It's probably going to stay and be great for some time, and it's built into Windows, etc. But Visual Studio Code is where they sort of put all the energy these days. And this is like a double insult to IT people, right? It's Visual Studio Code. Yeah, I'm an IT guy. I don't do Visual Studio, and I don't do code. What the hell? Right? And also it integrates with Git, so you need a source code repository to store your templates. That's like a triple insult. But the point is here that there's really no point in trying to resist this, because we're already there. And those who embrace using Visual Studio Code to do their templating and run PowerShell from, as you see I have been doing, from inside of Visual Studio Code, will definitely be much more effective and proficient. You will have a library of templates. If you don't today, then you'll get one eventually, because that's the only way to do effective automation on Azure, to use lots of templates. So that's going to happen. Another funny thing is that Microsoft builds, owns, and maintains and releases two open source command line tools. And it's funny, again, because there's a certain crowd that really loves PowerShell. They love Microsoft, they love PowerShell, they've been doing that a long time. But then there's other people that Microsoft also wants to have as customers. And they don't love, maybe not even Microsoft, but they certainly don't love PowerShell. So Microsoft kind of had no choice but to build a second thing that does the same. And both of them are open source, and PowerShell now runs on Linux. And I mean, come on. It's pretty crazy, but it's life, and so we have two. I'm partial to PowerShell myself. it doesn't actually matter. I really like the very nice syntax in the command line interface, but most of my customers are PowerShell-y, and that means that I usually use PowerShell. But both of these are really good. You can use, of course, code, as in programming code. There is a Nougat package with, in this case, a Fluent API, which you can use to, from your application, provision resources in Azure. This would go and provision us a virtual machine. So I just copied that from some page because it was nice and large. Statement here with the dots there to go define a virtual machine with a region, with this resource group, with this network, and so forth. And I need an IP address and some configuration stuff, and then .create async. That would send a message to Azure to create that from code. Pretty cool. So that can be done as well. So I'm going to tell you now the secret about Azure, okay? The secret is that there ain't nothing going on but the rest. I kind of already told you this, right? But we're going to go anyway to see if, okay, I clicked the link in PowerPoint and sometimes it doesn't do what I want it to. Let's see. There we go. We're going to go to, and I wonder if, have you guys been here at resources.azure.com? Some of these features are built into the Azure Portal these days, but in resources.azure.com, we can start to drill down into our resource groups and see our things, and into our subscriptions here. Let's see what we have here. It's actually my corporate homepage. We can look at that. And see what providers are we using down there. Some SQL, some storage apparently. Oh, there's a web application. Good. Let's open that up. Oh yeah, server farms again and sites. And then we can scroll down and see there's a couple of web applications there. And here's this thing here. This is my corporate website. All of this stuff is all the properties that are set for my web application. I can actually literally edit that in here and change settings on it. And sometimes I actually change the right ones. And you can do a put and then submit that back. And that's going to communicate over this RESTful API here that we have been talking about. So the secret is this that I wanted to show you. We are talking here with the management endpoint, as we have been saying, right? This is the management endpoint that we are talking with. And then it says /subscriptions, and there's the unique identifier for my subscription. It's not a secret or anything, it just has a unique name, or a GUID. It also has a human readable name, right? But this is the unique identifier. /resource group, and there's the resource group name right there, Loftysoft Corporate. And then it uses the provider, which is microsoft.web/sites. And then finally, this is my homepage, resource name, right? So this whole thing that I showed you here from the beginning, right, is a URL that you can talk to. It's a RESTful endpoint that you can communicate with. Yes, that's one thing that it is, but it's also a URI because it's a unique identifier for this resource. No other resource in Azure has the same name, the same URI. So what that means is that if you have many subscriptions, right, you may have many resource groups inside of your subscription, and then that could be like the branches of trees, right? And then you have resources. The resources would be the leaves in your subscription tree. And we're all tech people. We can understand a tree. It's simple, right? And if you have many subscriptions, you have a little forest going, right? So the secret of Azure is that you always thought that it was a cloud. It's in fact not. It's a forest. So the reason I tell this geeky little story is to give you a mental picture that it's not more complicated than that. It really isn't. It's resource groups with resources. It's a tree. And I think it's kind of a useful mental model to have, actually. And it kind of gives you something to hold on to when you think that things are complicated in Azure. They're not. Okay, we jumped to the wrong slide. Give me 1 second. So there's that's the secret of Azure. It's actually quite simple. Don't tell anyone. Another thing that you could go to is to GitHub. If you want to start to look at templates, you can, write GitHub Azure templates in your favorite Bing, and you will definitely find it. I can hopefully click on that as well. I'm going to do it this way instead. See if my, yeah, that works. Good. There's literally hundreds of templates in here, and odds are pretty good if you want to deploy something, anything at all, that you can go in here and search and find maybe, hey, let's see, oh, I want to deploy a Redis cache. That's cool. Let's do that one. That gives you a template for it, template parameters and such, little description sometimes what that is, but also a button, which means that you can click from here and deploy that to Azure, the thing that you're looking at right now. So you can inspect that template that you have there, and you can go and deploy that to Azure. It's going to give you a custom deployment. Azure is in fact capable, or the ARM model is in fact capable of using a URI to download a template. So it picks the template from GitHub and starts a custom deployment. And here you can then enter values for the parameters, and then you can click the purchase button down below, which says now you're buying something that's actually going to cost you money if you do this, and you can deploy your template to Azure. That's a really good resource to start with, and I actually go there myself quite frequently. I should contribute to that. It's actually you can submit a pull request if you have a cool template that you want to put up there. That works as well. Now, we have not so much time remaining, but I will briefly tell you about the things that you can do now that you have resource management, right? I think the most important one is role-based access control. That gives you the ability to sign in users or give users access to specific things. So you can secure access, and you have granular permissions there. You can give read access, you can give special custom access actually as well. Once I created a read access to the production environment, I created a web application slot, which is something you can do with app services, a staging slot, and then I allowed the team to deploy to the staging slot. So they were contributors to the staging slot. They were able to deploy to it. But because they were only they only had read access to the production environment, they couldn't actually click the button that says swap, which puts staging into production, and vice versa. They couldn't do that. And so I created a custom role which only had the permission swap web applications. And then I assigned the team to that so that they are able to do the swapping, but they can't change anything else in production. They can't modify the size or the scale or anything. It's all inside of production. So it's pretty evil, but it works really well. That's what you can do. If you want to, you can go in and start creating custom roles, etc. Another thing that you can do, which is really also very, very important. In the beginning, maybe not so acute, but very quickly you will want to start putting tags on your resources. This gives you, the help with all of these things. Gives you visibility, and you have a growing service catalog. When you go beyond like 50 resources, it's starting to get complicated. Which resource is what is which, and oh, by the way, whose database is that? Right? What do you do when you find a database that you don't know whose it is? You shut it off, right? And see who comes running, right? That's what you do. And then you feel like, ha, it's yours. Okay, wait, I'm going to write your name here in a little tag, because with Azure you can supply tags. So here's the template version of that. You can specify tags, up to 15 tags for every resource, and you decide exactly what key you should have and what value, which means that you can have cost center, you can have responsible owner, you can have which service does this belong to, which environment is this production, is this QA. These tags you can set in here, and the coolness is that then you can filter things that have a certain tag, and you can find out who owns the resource, and you can assign it. Maybe a team is responsible for a set of resources, and you set the team name there or something like that. But the QA question is always curious, because at some point, these Excel people, the bean counters, they will come and ask, how much is production costing? How much is R&D? How much is the QA environment cost? And so forth. And with tags, you can effectively find that out, because the tags that you saw, the keys and the values, they show up in the bill, right? So they show up exactly in the monthly bill, and the bean counters can go nuts and just divide the bill and figure out and see over time how much is the increased cost of development and so forth. Really, really important. If it's not important in the beginning, it's going to be important once you get beyond a certain point with your costs. Another cool thing that you can do is you can set policies for your resources. These are custom rules that govern the shape of your resources. And you can do things with them. They're also JSON. You can do stuff like this. For instance, these are policies. That's a policy definition. You can execute those and you can define them in Azure, and then you can apply them to maybe a resource group or a subscription or something, so that anytime that anyone does a deployment, it's going to validate the deployment against these policies. So it's going to say, hey, does your resource have a field called tags, and does it have a key? Does that contain a key called cost center? If there isn't such a thing, we will deny the deployment. Okay, that's the evil manager version. It's also a second nice trick to play on your coworkers, because if you set this in effect in Azure, nobody can use the Azure Portal to create resources. Because in the Azure Portal, you can't specify tags when you do the deployment. So it's actually going to fail every time in the portal. But that doesn't matter, because you should use templates to deploy. The nice manager version of the same is this. If there is a tag, if there is a tags field, and there is a cost center, and there isn't a cost center field, well then we go and append the cost center R&D. So very nicely, if you have maybe an R&D department, and they're probably doing the right thing if they're creating and destroying resources all the time, they're R&Ding, they're supposed to do that. But you can still apply the tags to those resources, because they're going to forget, or they're using the portal and so forth. So this is the nice manager version that you can also do. You can go and change with a policy the actual deployment that is going on. Right. The cool thing about all of this is that this is audited. Whenever you change or modify anything at all in Azure, a very detailed, well, it's actually a piece of JSON again, is logged with exactly who did what to what. So it's right there. And in the interest of time, I made a screenshot of that. So you can go into the Azure portal and see, hey, somebody tried to delete a resource group and that failed. And that was me. Maybe I had a policy in place that said, or a lock that said you can't delete these resources. All of this data is yours, right? But it's not stored forever in there. I think it's got a retention period if it's 30 or 60 or 90 days or something. But you can download that data if you want to have that for compliance and keep it somewhere else if you like. But normally, you got enough data in there within the retention period. And you can go in and see what happens. And because you have this, right? Because you have this, you can get alerted when things happen. So this data is alertable, if you will. You can set an alert when somebody creates, a specific resource size, or somebody creates a resource in the wrong region, or something like that. You can set a policy to prevent people from actually deploying to the wrong region anyway. But if there is a policy violation, that's logged here. You set a policy that says you must deploy inside of Australia. We can't deploy our resources outside of Australia. And then if somebody tries to do that, that's going to fail. And the fail is going to leave an audit trail. And the audit trail, you can get an alert. So you can see that somebody tried to deploy in Southeast Asia rather than Australia. You can go over to his office. It's always Dave. And you go, Dave, smack him in the back of the head. You cannot deploy the resources in Southeast Asia. You know this, right? So you have all the data. The reason we are doing this, the reason we are doing Azure ARM templating and access control and policies and tagging and all these things, there's more, we don't have time to talk about it all, is that we want to remove human error from the equation. We want to automate things as much as we can. So we want control and security and make sure that the wrong people cannot change the wrong things, and really understand what the cost is of our resources as well. All of these things are, achievable. What you need to do is learn about templates and figure out this automation piece, right? This word works like a little incantation. If you don't say it 3 times, it's going to lose power. So you have to always, you probably should click your heels as well. Automation, okay? That's what we're targeting here, and that's what we want to do. It's super important, and well, all these benefits are available. So I hope you start, if you haven't, start using templates immediately, in fact. Before we end, I'm going to first actually mention that there is another session by yours truly tomorrow at this time, actually, in room 4. And you should come and see that. I'm going to rant for an hour about things that are, not only design patterns specifically, but I'm going to talk in terms of some experiences that I've had in the cloud, and, should hopefully be entertaining. Before we end, are there any questions or thoughts, comments, personal attacks? No? I must have been extremely clear. That's okay. We will skip the questions and just say that there are some new challenges here in the cloud. It's well worth it, well worth it to learn to manage Azure in a proper way. Okay? The resource manager is central. You have to use it. If you don't, you're selling yourself short. You're going to sit and do manual things. You're going to do repetitive tasks, and you're going to get it wrong because you're human, and things will go bad. And you will spend all your time scratching your head and running around the Azure Portal. It's not fun. This is much more fun. Automation is awesome. What you could also do, if you want to learn more about this and get hands-on with it, is you can contact me and we can set up this workshop that I have. I can come and teach you everything that you need to know about managing Azure and monitoring Azure. We didn't even have time to talk about monitoring today. It's a big piece as well. Monitoring, managing, and handling Azure the proper way. I'm going to leave you now and say thank you very much for coming today. I appreciate the attention.